Hello and welcome to this webinar on key issues in reusing data. My name is Jennifer Buckley and I work in user support and training for the UK Data Service, and I'm joined by my colleague Maureen Hooper, who, as well as being part of our user support and training team, is a lecturer at the University of Suffolk. So here's an overview of the webinar. So we're going to start with a general discussion about data available for reuse and some key issues in reusing data. I'm going to then focus on the use of quantitative data, and Maureen's going to talk about the use of qualitative data. And together we're going to talk for about 35 minutes. Then there's going to be time for questions at the end. To start off with reusing data, so through many different methods, data useful for social researchers is continually being collected, and many data collections are then archived and made available for others to use in secondary data analysis. So data comes from data collectors, which may be research organisations such as NatSem, who lead on the British Social Attitude Survey, or official statistics organisations such as the Office for National Statistics. There's also large-scale academic projects such as Understanding Society, and then individual researchers. So here there's a picture of Peter Townsend, who did some very important research into poverty. So often data collectors are collecting data for a primary purpose, which is planned, and then the data sharing then allows data to be used by others in secondary data analysis. And in secondary data analysis, data can be used in different ways from its original purpose. So there's some significant advantages to reusing data. So perhaps most of all is you can use data that you could not collect yourself. So this data could be collected in the past. So for example, if you're interested in working conditions over time, data such as surveys such as the labour force survey, which go back to the 1970s, provide key data that could not be collected now. Reusing data can also be time and cost effective. So major data collections require resource and expertise. That's often beyond that of single researchers or small research teams. So the UK Data Service collection includes surveys of samples in the thousands that can be downloaded from the website after a short registration process. The data is also high quality. So data in the main collection undergoes checks for quality and clarity. And key data collections come from trained researchers and methodologists at universities or government departments and statistics authorities. Another reason is that many of the ethical issues around data collection have already sort of been dealt with, and then this saves you time in the research process as well. So together these reasons may mean that secondary data analysis could be the only option available to you, or perhaps just the most efficient option. However, there's some important challenges and disadvantages to secondary data analysis. So first, as you were not party to the data collection, you will not have the insider's understanding of the data, and as a result you need to make effort to get to know the data, which in practice means consulting closely with any data documentation. Ethics also still apply and affect how data can be used. For instance, issues around confidentiality can limit your access to data. So access to data about things like geographical location of research participants is highly controlled. Also, data meeting your needs just might not be available, or it might be available but just not perfect. So, for example, it might be slightly older than you'd like, or the wording of the survey question might not be ideal, or perhaps the interviewer didn't probe in the way that you would have liked. So therefore, researchers looking to reuse data need to, one, sort of make an effort to get to grips with that data, and then also sometimes be pragmatic about whether the data are good enough for meeting your research needs. So just to quickly illustrate, so here's an example of the research plan with secondary data analysis. So you might start with the research question and then look for some data, evaluate the data to see if it might be useful, analyse the data, and then answer your research question. And it kind of looks like a nice linear process. But often it's not like this. So for example, you might look for data and find that there's data for your research isn't quite available, so then you might either sort of slightly tweak or redesign the research question. Then perhaps evaluating the data might make you think, I can't quite answer that research question, and then that leads to further tweaks and redesigns. And then also analysis might reveal further issues that takes you through the process again. So we now have a more complicated picture of the research process, and throughout this process you need to be able to understand the data. So to understand data and its suitability for your research, you must look at what information was collected and who that information was collected from, when and where, and then any changes to the raw data before being archived. And then you can find out all of this information in the documentation, which itself might include user guides or questionnaires and interview schedules. So turning to quantitative data, I'm going to start with a case study and then look at some different types of quantitative data available and the type of documentation you might find and some key issues to consider. So the Crime Survey for England and Wales, or formerly the British Crime Survey, is an example of a repeated cross-sectional survey, and it provides a very important source of information about levels of crime, in part because it provides a measure of crime that's independent from reporting to the police. The survey is annual, and then interviews are actually conducted throughout the year, and there's generally a sample of around 35,000 individuals aged 16 plus, and also 3,000 aged 10 to 15. And it asks people about their experiences of crime within the previous 12 months, and then also a range of questions covering demographics and crime-related subjects such as attitudes towards the police or the criminal justice system. Data from the survey is stored as individual anonymous records, so here's an example of what the data looks like in the statistics package SPSS. And the data is available at different levels of access. So there's a standard end user license, which allows registered users to download data and analyse it on their own computers. And there's also a secure access version that contains more sensitive information and is slightly more difficult to access. Here's an example of the crime survey being used. So this is an important study about violence against people with disabilities by Hind Khalife and his colleagues. So they used data from 2009-2010 when it was the British Crime Survey, and they were able to carry out the study because of the introduction of disability measures at this time. And for this particular study they had to successfully apply for a version of the data under special licence. And it resulted in a sample of around 46,000 adults, and just over 9,000 of them had at least one limiting disability. And the findings from the study were that adjusting for things like age, sex, socioeconomic characteristics, they found that disability increases risk of experiencing violence. Levels of victimisation are highest amongst those with mental health problems, and they were able to estimate that around 116,000 victims of violence could be attributed to disability. So there's different kinds of quantitative data available, and they're all suitable for different kinds of analysis. So to examine individuals, families, households or businesses at one point in time, you can use a wide range of cross-sectional survey data or census microdata. If you want to look at trends over time, there are also some repeated cross-sectional surveys such as the Crime Survey for England and Wales, but also others such as the Labour Force Survey. And then to follow individuals over time, you want longitudinal data. So Understanding Society is a great example of this kind of data. It's a household panel survey that's currently following around 40,000 households and asks questions on a wide range of topics. In terms of geography, so if we're looking at small geographical areas, census aggregate data and flow data are good sources. And to compare countries, there's collections of international macrodata such as the World Bank indicators. So to start finding out more about data collection, you can start with the catalogue record. So this will tell you a lot about sort of where, when and why the data was collected. For instance, it contains information about the date and geographic coverage. And then it also gives access to the other documentation that supports the data, so things like the user guides and technical reports. So understanding who was asked what questions is then a key issue in survey data. So for example here we've got a small part of the questionnaire for the Labour Force survey. You'll find that documentation looks a bit different from survey to survey, but this gives a general idea. So in this case, we're seeing information about a variable that's been called flex 10, and this relates to working arrangements. You can see the exact wording of the question, along with the range of answers and their coding. And if you look below, it says that the question is asked if the respondent is in work, and it also explains how it was identified that those respondents were in work. So in general, computer-aided interviewing is used often, and it makes it easy to send respondents through the questionnaire by different routes, depending on their answers. Therefore, many questions may only be applicable to some of the sample, and it's important that we use the documentation to really kind of understand which questions were asked to which individuals. You can also find information about how data has been processed. So for example, here we see that variable flex 10 has been used to derive another variable indicating if someone has a 0-hour contract. And now for some considerations about samples. So surveys and similar sources almost always are based on samples. And one important question is the sample representative? So most of the major surveys from organisations like NATSA and the Office of National Statistics use random sampling methods, but you may need to consider who was in the sample. So for example, does it include all adults? Does it include just those in private addresses? And then there's also issues around the response rate, and if there's any information about differential response rates across the population. You'll also need to find out if you need to apply a survey weight. And then the second question is whether you have enough cases to make precise estimates. So the Crime Survey for Mid Wales has a large sample which should allow for precise estimates. However, surveys with smaller samples, and if you're particularly interested in doing analyses on small subpopulations, there may be insufficient cases in the sample to make really precise estimates. So for more information on these issues, we have some guides looking at survey weights and complex samples, and these can be found on our website. And then here's some further references and resources, which you'll be able to see in the slides after the webinar. And now I'm going to pass you over to Maureen to do some discussion around the reusing of qualitative data.
Thank you very much, Jen. I'm Maureen Haker, and I'll be talking about very similar things as Jen, but for qualitative data. First, I'm going to go through a couple different types of qualitative data reuse projects. Then I'll walk you through a case study of one of those types of reuse. Then do a quick overview on how to get started reusing data, including addressing a couple of the key issues that arise when trying to reuse specifically qualitative data. And finally, I'll show you how to find some qualitative data. So quality data reuse is not particularly common, but it's certainly becoming more common, and the UK Data Service is certainly offering more qualitative data sets and more resources in a very accessible way than it has been able to before. There's many different ways that you can reuse qualitative data. You can quite simply give a description or understanding of a particular social and historical point in time. Why this is useful is because you can see more of the data than what publications reveal. So you might not be able to see all of the data depending on what's available from the archive, but you can certainly see more of the data than was originally published. And this is useful because you won't be limited to what researchers thought was salient for their research questions and topics. You can explore it further and see what would really be of interest to your own questions. Another way to reuse data is to consider analyzing the methods that were used and look for lessons that might be gleaned about the most effective ways of sampling, data collection methods, or of even developing topic guides. One thing that's especially valuable to look at is how an interview was laid out before the interview was conducted. So that is, what kinds of questions interviewers thought they were going to ask, and then look at what was actually talked about in the interviews. There may be many reasons why certain questions are not asked in interviews. And some interview schedules are designed to be more flexible. And sometimes tangents just come up and you want to interrogate that further. But in any case, it's a really important skill to develop the intuition, to know what to do. And you really can't see that unless you start comparing interview schedules and the actual interview transcripts. Another reuse is called reanalysis, which looks at a wide range of approaches that you can take in the analysis of a data set. It usually means asking some kind of different research question than what the original researchers were trying to do. So for example, Clive Seal and Charteris Black did a study using comparative keyword analysis of illness narratives. The original illness narratives had looked exclusively for health research. They were specifically looking at how to diagnose based on certain symptoms. When Seal and Charteris Black came along to do the comparative keyword analysis, they were much more interested in an analysis of the discussions rather than the actual health issues that came up in the interviews. So the questions can be very different in that sort of way. Or sometimes the question can be on a similar topic to the research, original research, but have a slightly different focus. So for example, Joanna Bornat looked at gerontology as a topic and found 2 different data sets looking specifically at gerontology. However, Bornat's research question was on racism, which wasn't the focus of the original work, but the data set was rich enough to allow her to explore this theme within that existing data. And finally, data is also reused for teaching and learning. Jo Haynes is one person who does this quite a bit. It gives students the opportunity to work with real data and also gives them some hands-on experience working through analysis of data and the issues that arose from methodological choices within that project. There's a number of teaching data sets available through our website, as well as other teaching resources which use archived data to walk students through various methodological and thematic issues. There is a 5th type of reuse, which is exemplified by the case study I'll go through with you now. And this case is a re-study, which is where you replicate the methods of a study for purposes of comparison. So you might be looking at a historical comparison, which could help you demonstrate how society has changed over time, or it could be geographical, social class, or comparison with basically any other variable to show differences between subgroups. This example of this kind of reuse project is from the collection school leaver study. The original study was conducted by Ray Paul in the late 70s as part of a much wider community study on the Isle of Sheppey. The UK Data Service holds a number of collections related to this community study, but the school leaver study specifically looked at student aspirations. So Ray Paul asked teachers to set a particular kind of essay just before students were due to leave school, prompting them to imagine that they were reaching the end of their life and something made them think back to the time they left school. They were then assigned to write a short essay of what happened in their life over the next 30 to 40 years. In 2009, Graham Crowe and Don Lyon, and that's Graham Crowe with Ray Paul in that picture, decided to reanalyze this data set and focus solely on student aspirations. Using the very same methodology, they conducted a re-study on school leavers for students on the Isle of Sheppey in 2009. The prompt they supplied to students in 2010 during data collection was nearly the same. Imagine that you're at the end of your life and reflect back on what you've done since leaving school. They then transcribed the essays and compared the themes from the set of essays currently to the set of essays that was collected by Ray Paul in the 70s. And you can see the wording of the prompt here with a small snippet of an essay here as well. And there was a challenge to doing this restudy of this specific study. When Ray Paul collected the data initially, he sort of stumbled into finding that teachers had assigned this kind of essay, and they were able to share those essays with him. But he didn't have absolute control over how the essay was presented and collected. So the originals, also show some of the markup from teachers because these were graded essays, When Graham Crowe did the restudy, they weren't marked, and the research team had much more control over how the essay prompt was delivered. Crowe goes into some detail about this and devised this prompt based on conversations with Ray Paul about the original study. Nevertheless, this is a point that Crowe addresses specifically in his publications and comes to the conclusion that the overall picture painted by the essays as a collective still offers a valuable comparison. And the findings do show a shift in aspirations, as you might imagine. So here's a few more details about what they received back. Slightly different gender divide, but fairly similar amount of data received. Both data sets covered the same general themes of health, education, career, family and leisure, although in very different ways. But how exactly were they different? In 1978, students expected much more grounded and arguably mundane sorts of jobs. Career progression was gradual and followed on from a lot of hard work. And sometimes there was talk of periods of unemployment or even, quite morbidly, an early death. And you can see a few examples in the left column of some of the quotations from those essays, such as the one on the bottom. I longed for something exciting and challenging, but yet again, I had to settle for second best. I began working in a large clothes factory. 2010, however, showed students imagining well-paid, instantaneous jobs filled with choice, but also with some uncertainty. Crowe and his research team also noted a clear influence of celebrity culture in those essays. So, for example, you have the quote on the bottom of a girl who writes, "In my future, I want to become either a dance teacher, a hairdresser, or a professional show jumper, horse rider. If I do become a dancer, my dream would be to dance for Beyonce or someone really famous." The impact of this study, however, spans beyond the interesting changes that they've noted in young people's aspirations. Their study was part of a much bigger community project on the past, present, and future of the Isle of Sheppey. The goal was to engage the community alongside this research and find innovative ways of including participants in research outputs. As part of this initiative, they published the Living and Working on Sheppey website, which has videos and artwork produced by the residents of the Isle of Sheppey, as well as ways for those who participated in the research back in the 1970s to stay in touch with each other and read about the history of their community. They helped to create a shared history and memory of what living on the Isle of Sheppey means among this community. There's a number of publications where you can read a bit more about the project and the results of the study. As I've said, the case study demonstrated just one of the ways of reusing qualitative data, which is, again, a complete restudy and comparison between two data sets. If you'd like to have a closer look at any of those slides, we'll post them on our events page on the UK Data Service website. Okay, so now we've covered the different types of reuse projects you can do, but what about actually doing secondary analysis? As with quantitative data, the first thing you'll need to do is to orient yourself to the original research project. I think the main point here, which is very much the same as reusing quantitative research, is not to underestimate the amount of time it will take to get acquainted with the data set. There may be multiple levels of context to get through in order to really understand the data. And what I mean by that is that you have more than just the data collected at the time of the interview or data collection, but you might also need to consider the metadata of the participant, so their gender or their age or their social class, or the historical time period in which that data was collected, or where that data was collected. So really the idea is that you need to understand the data set as a whole in order to understand what was collected. So really you want to try and get to the root of what the data can convey. The documentation provided with the data set will certainly be a useful starting point for this. It often contains more information about the methodology, so it might have an interview schedule or a call for participants, or sometimes it includes segments from publications that arise from the original study, or I've also seen funding applications with progress reports. I've also seen some studies which have sections that are written up by the principal investigator about particular features of that data set. So for example, the sample might have a lengthy explanation. Annette Lawson, in her 1980s adultery study, it had a particular focus on the sample. And given the sensitivity of the topic, she was talking to people about adultery in the 80s, which was a bit, obviously taboo at the time. So the sampling became, a real focus for her because she wanted it to be representative of the UK as a whole. So she ended up writing this 56-page document just on her sample. I've also seen, quite a lot of background contextual material that's taken from the area of research. So there's been local government meeting minutes, pamphlets from organizations in the area, letters from participants and other correspondence. And all of this really just helps to paint a picture of what was going on around the study. And all of it hopefully should be included in the documentation. You might also need to consider the sample. So for example, if the data set is too large, you might need to take a subsample of it. This may not be so much of an issue with qualitative research, since they tend to be much smaller studies anyways. But there are some collections which have got a large amount of funding, so you'll need to carefully consider what's actually feasible. So the Edwardians collection, for example, which was put together by oral historian Paul Thompson, and it's widely considered to be the first oral history of Britain, contains 453 80-plus page interviews that would take a considerable amount of time to read and reread, so you may need to take a sample of it. Conversely, you might find interviews from different data sets which complement each other, and you might decide that you just want to pick out those that are relevant for you and make a new larger data set. And you can do that. If it's more useful to combine those sorts of interviews, you can sort of be strategic about your sample and what data you're using. And finally, you'll need to think through how you will approach the data. You might use an inductive strategy where you start with the data and see what comes from that, or you might use a deductive strategy where you have a much firmer idea about what you're looking at and what you want from the data. Both are equally valid, but you'll need to consider your approach before you get started. So this was a brief overview of a couple of key issues when getting started with qualitative data reuse. If you're looking for more guidance or discussion about these issues, there's two sources I would highly recommend. First and foremost is a chapter out of Silverman's most recent edition of Qualitative Research. Libby Bishop wrote this chapter specifically on reusing qualitative data, and it's filled with further examples of reuse and addresses these key issues in more depth. If you have access to this book through your library, I definitely recommend starting with this chapter. There is also a Timescapes Methods guide series which is available online. So the one pictured here by Sarah Irwin and Mandy Winterton is short. It's just a few pages, but it's another great guide just to help you get started. And of course, there's other resources available through our website. So if you explore the Use Data tab, which is at the top of the page, and then select Secondary Analysis using the left-hand menu, you can find tips for reusing both quantitative and qualitative research. And here you can find there's a short guide as well as a bibliography of sources that can help you get started. And finally, I want to go through just a couple of the ways to look for qualitative data. So we have two ways that you may have seen before for those of you who have had a little glance at the UK Data Service before. So first is by going to Key Data, and there's a Qualitative and Mixed Methods tab. And the other is going via our catalog, Discover, which works a bit like Google. You simply type in the keyword, as been done here in this example with food, and then you can filter down to the type of data you want to see using the facets on the left-hand side of the menu. However, we also have a relatively new tool, which is specific to qualitative data, and that's QualiBank. So like Discover, you can type in a keyword, but instead of searching through the abstracts and catalog pages like Discover does, QualiBank actually searches through the data itself. And this means that you might be able to identify relevant interviews that might be spread across different collections, or find a collection that you didn't think this theme might come up. In this example, I've typed in typhoid, and you can see it's searched through and highlighted in the data itself where typhoid is mentioned. The first couple of hits were from the Morale and Home Intelligence Reports collection, but further down there were also examples from the Edwardian interviews. And when you click through one of those search results in QualiBank, so I clicked through one of those interviews, and this page came up. And it brings you normally directly straight to the spot in the interview or whatever the data is where that keyword was mentioned. But if you scroll to the top of the page, you can see that there is external resources and collections documentation. And if I click on that, it brings you down to the bottom of the page after the interview, which includes things like audio extracts of the transcripts, images related to that interview, or sometimes there's some web sources. Finally, the last feature in QualiBank, if you want to cite directly from an interview transcript, you can simply click the Create Citation button, which is on the left-hand side, and highlight the portion that you're interested in. You then click Retrieve Citation, and you get this little pop-up. And you can basically just copy-paste this citation into your document. It's got what's called a persistent identifier, which is the URL that you see at the end of the citation. And that will bring your readers directly to this exact paragraph that you've highlighted within QualiBank. And the whole idea of this feature is to introduce a new layer of transparency to your work. And it helps accurately cite your data that you're reusing. Okay, thank you so much for coming. And do be in touch if either you use data and you'd like to tell us about it, or if you have a query.